Welcome to Unlocking High Performance, a podcast for leaders who believe great results should never come at the expense of their people. My name's Jason Lauritsen. I'm an advisor to CEOs and leadership teams who want to accelerate performance without burning people out. One of the most common mistakes that I see leaders make is to confuse a lack of clarity with a lack of motivation or a character flaw. I was just talking with an executive this week about a leader on their team who they're frustrated with. And this leader that they're frustrated with is a high performer, produces a sort of a high-performing producer, right? The thing that they do best, they do really well, but they're failing as a leader. They're failing to model leadership behavior and other positive behavior in their role. And this is creating friction both within the leadership team that this individual is a part of, but also with their staff and with others in the organization. Now, this executive, as they were explaining it to me, his perspective was that this leader just doesn't care about how they impact others in the organization, that they only care about advancing their own interests, right? What serves their own interests and what they care about. But when I started asking some questions, what became pretty clear right away is that this leader had never had anyone really clearly explain to them the expectations of being a leader in the organization, let alone putting that down in writing in like a role description or something that they could use to guide their behavior. And so if you're this executive and you haven't created this kind of clarity for that individual leader, why would you expect them to behave in the way that you want? If they do, you're just lucky because they're having to guess or assume. Now, instead of recognizing their own failure to create clarity, this executive wanted to put blame on the individual, right? Because it's easier to do that, right? Rather than take accountability for my role and not setting you up for success. When you aren't successful, I'm going to blame you. You're not motivated enough, or you just don't care, or whatever that is. And both people here are frustrated. The executive and the leader are both frustrated with one another because of course they are. Right? On the one hand, the executive is saying, I've got a leader that is underperforming or isn't performing the way they should. And then you've got this leader who's like, what do you want from me? Right? I'm doing my job. And here's the thing, this situation plays out all of the time, more than any of us would like to admit. It happens every day, all day inside of organizations, where a lack of clarity about expectations is sort of playing out in terms of friction between a leader and a person on their team. As a performance problem, the leader's frustrated with the individual not doing what's expected. The individual is like, I don't know what's expected of me, so how in the world am I supposed to do it? I'm doing my best, and they're at an impasse. The key to fixing this, to eliminating this issue, is recognizing that the most powerful and important driver of performance at work is clarity. So today, we're going to talk about 2 simple practices to help you create clarity with your team. The first practice is what I call the golden rule of management. And the golden rule of management is, if it matters, put it in writing. Having to put something into writing forces clarity, because as you write things out, you tend to recognize where you aren't as clear as you thought you were. You've probably had to do this before where, going clear back to even when you were in school, right? You have to write a paper. In your head, it feels like you've got it all worked out. But then when you actually sit down to start writing, it's much harder than you thought, or it doesn't come together in the way you think. We always think we are clearer in our mind than we actually are. When we put it on writing, it forces the places where we're not as clear to become really painfully obvious so that we can then fix those. Plus, in the context of work, when we put something in writing, the other person can react to it. It makes it easier for them to really understand and interpret it, and it also gives them time to process it. So often as leaders and managers, we sit down with someone, we explain something, or we tell them something, or we share an expectation, and we tell them once, and then we part ways, and we assume that we've been clear, right? We said it once, it's over with. And that person, we don't know what they heard or how they interpreted it or what was going on in their head when we did that, right? When we put it on paper, not only is it on paper so that they can have time to process it, but they can do that work over time. They can revisit it. So that's a second reason. And I think the other reason that putting things in writing is really powerful is that it signals that whatever this thing is that you're putting in writing is really important, right? Contracts, policies, written warnings, all of these things are things that we put in writing in business and at work because clarity is really important, right? And so when we're putting something in writing with an employee, it signals that this matters. Right? When we're putting something in writing as a team together, it signals this matters. It matters enough that we're going to put this down in writing. So as a leader, if there's an expectation or an agreement that impacts how performance happens or how you're going to evaluate performance, it should be in writing. And if it's not, you're leaving it up to chance, right? You're undermining performance, and you're creating downstream friction for yourself and for that individual. Yes, it will take longer to do this than simply telling something to someone. But when you think back over the course of your career or your job managing, leading other people, how much time have you lost or had to sort of give back when someone wasn't clear, or you sent them off with some instructions, they went off and did something, they came back, it wasn't anywhere near what you wanted, or they're off behaving or doing things that are not what you'd want them to do, and then you have to clean it up or you have to address it after the fact. How much has that cost you, both in execution of performance, but also just in having to clean up the mess on the back end? So a little time up front, creating clarity, saves you time as a leader downstream, but also it almost guarantees that you're going to get better performance from the individual or the team. So that's practice number one. Golden rule of management: if it matters, put it in writing. The second practice I want to share with you today is related. It builds on that. And it's a practice I call comparing notes. And it's something that you can use with an individual, as a manager with an individual that you lead, or with someone that you're collaborating with, but you can also use it with a team to create greater clarity. And usually this is something that you'll use when you aren't sure if you have clarity, but you know that clarity really matters. And so the first step is to really be clear about where you aren't clear or what it is exactly that you need greater clarity about. So is it an expectation about the job? Is it an agreement that we need to make as a team for how we're going to communicate or treat each other? Right? There's so many things that, could be an area of focus. We just need to first start, what is it that we are not clear about or we want to be more clear about? So define your problem, I guess. And then once you have that, both parties or all parties, so if it's two people, both of you, if it's a team, everyone on the team then writes down what they are clear about or what they feel clear about in regard to the question or the issue that you're solving. So if it's, if I think about the example earlier that I shared in this conversation that I had with this executive and this where they're struggling with this leader, you might say, well, it seems like we're not clear about what it means to be a leader in this organization at this level. And so if that's what it is, then what I would do is this executive and this leader and whoever else is important in this conversation, you would each write down, what does it mean to be a leader? And maybe, give 3 examples of what it looks like to, be a leader, to demonstrate leadership behavior in the organization, in your work, in this role. And so you would each write down your answer. And then once everyone has written down what they're clear about, you compare what you wrote, right? This is why it's called compare notes. So you've written it down, now you compare. And what this practice does is it immediately reveals where you have clarity and where you don't. And then you can fix it, right? Then you can address it. You can discuss it. You can figure out, if you have a disconnect or a lack of clarity, you talk your way through it. And then you use the golden rule and you document, you write down now what you've become clear about. What agreements have you made? What expectations have you set and agreed to? I know it seems almost overly simple, but this is an incredibly, incredibly effective and powerful practice. I like to use this practice with leadership teams to illustrate how often we assume we have clarity, but what we actually have is the assumption of clarity or the delusion of clarity. And that assumption or delusion allows a lack of clarity to exist and cause friction and confusion and distraction kind of downstream of the leadership team. Clarity is the rocket fuel of performance. And creating clarity isn't complicated, but it's also not easy because it requires intention and it requires a commitment of time. And you have to spend time with the people you are intending to create clarity with and for in order for it to work. But when you make that time to get really clear, it will propel you and your team and your organization forward. Thank you for listening. Please go invest in clarity. It will pay you back in multiples. I'll see you next time.